all uncovered through one widow's courageous fight to save her late husband's historic home and the crumbling stone wall that would reveal America's most astonishing Civil War secret cache buried beneath her property for over 150 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The January rain pounded mercilessly against the windows of the colonial era farmhouse as Margaret Holloway descended the worn wooden steps into what had become her personal nightmare. At 62, she never imagined she'd be fighting tooth and nail to keep the home where she and her late husband, Richard, had planned to spend their retirement years in peaceful rural Virginia. Yet here she was, standing ankle-deep in murky water that had been steadily rising for 4 days straight, clutching a condemnation notice that gave her exactly 72 hours to make the basement habitable or watch the county declare her beloved home uninhabitable forever. The flooding had begun during the worst winter storm Virginia's Shenandoah Valley had experienced in decades. What should have been a minor inconvenience, some expected seepage during heavy rainfall, had transformed into a catastrophe when the nearby creek overflowed its banks, sending thousands of gallons of water cascading into the basement of Willow Creek Farm, located at 1863 Battlefield Road. The historic property, built in 1789, had weathered countless Virginia winters, but it wasn't prepared for the kind of environmental disaster that had overwhelmed the quiet community of New Liberty. Margaret unfolded the crumpled condemnation notice from her sweater pocket, reading it for what must have been the 20th time that morning. The bureaucratic language was cold and impersonal, reducing a lifetime of memories to a series of code violations and structural deficiencies. New Liberty County Housing Department. Property unsafe for habitation due to flooding damage, electrical hazards, and potential foundation compromise. Final notice. Compliance required within 72 hours, or property will be condemned and demolished. The weight of those words pressed down on Margaret like the gray January sky outside. She surveyed the basement that had once been her sanctuary, the place where she'd preserved homegrown vegetables from their garden, stored Christmas decorations and wedding gifts, and where Richard had spent countless hours restoring antique furniture and organizing his collection of Civil War artifacts. Now it was a disaster zone filled with murky water carrying the remnants of a lifetime, floating photo albums, waterlogged furniture, and the scattered remains of 42 years of marriage. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Margaret. Richard had spent 35 years as a structural engineer specializing in historical restoration, keeping centuries-old buildings intact through careful preservation techniques. He understood construction better than almost anyone, how water moved through stone foundations, how timber frames settled over time, how the bones of a historic building held together under stress. He had died just 14 months ago, leaving behind a house that was mortgage-free but desperately in need of updates and repairs that Margaret simply couldn't afford on her widow's pension of $1,486 a month. The medical bills from Richard's final illness had drained their savings entirely. Pancreatic cancer was relentless and expensive, even with Medicare, and the 18 months of treatments, hospital stays, and specialist visits had consumed the nest egg they'd built over 4 decades of careful living. Margaret had already sold Richard's truck, most of his tools, and even his cherished collection of Civil War books to pay for the care that ultimately couldn't save him. Now she was left with a house that needed a new roof, updated plumbing, and apparently flood remediation that was completely beyond her financial means. The lowest estimate she'd received for professional water removal and foundation repair was $18,000 more than her entire annual income. "Mrs. Holloway, this pump just isn't cutting it," called out Ben Larson, her neighbor's college-age son who had volunteered to help with the water removal. He was standing waist-deep in the flooded basement, positioning a rental pump that seemed woefully inadequate for the job. The motor whined with effort, but the water level had barely budged an inch since they'd started working 3 hours ago. "We need something industrial grade, and we need to figure out where all this water is coming from. The rain stopped yesterday, but this is still rising somehow." Ben was a good kid, 20 years old, with the kind of earnest determination that reminded Margaret of Richard at that age. His father, John Larson, worked at the local lumber mill and had offered what help he could spare, but the Larson family was facing their own challenges. Ben's mother, Karen, worked as a home health aide, and they were saving every penny for Ben's tuition at Virginia Tech, where he was studying civil engineering. The fact that Ben was here at all, giving up his Saturday during winter break to help a neighbor, spoke to the kind of community spirit that had defined New Liberty since its founding shortly after the Revolutionary War. It was the kind of place where people still brought casseroles when someone was sick and pitched in when a neighbor needed help with harvest or home repairs. "Ben, we can't afford an industrial pump," Margaret replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "The rental on this little one is already $65 a day. We can't get the water out with what we have. I'm going to lose the house." She'd done the calculations obsessively over the past 4 days. The pump rental was draining what little emergency cash she had left. The estimate for professional flood remediation was $18,000, more than her entire annual income. The electrical work needed to bring the basement up to code would cost at least $5,000 more. Even if she could somehow afford the immediate repairs, she'd still need to address the roof, the aging plumbing system, and the dozen other maintenance issues that had been accumulating since Richard's death. It was a devastating reality. The house at Willow Creek Farm had been in Richard's family since his great-great-grandfather, Samuel Holloway, had purchased it in 1866. Samuel had been a Union Army veteran who'd fallen in love with the Shenandoah Valley while serving under General Philip Sheridan during the Civil War. When the fighting ended, he'd returned to the area, determined to build a new life in the region that had captivated him during the conflict. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret had heard the family stories countless times during holiday gatherings and anniversary celebrations. Samuel's journey from Union soldier to respected local farmer was the kind of American transformation story that seemed increasingly rare in today's economy. He'd worked for 7 years, saving every dollar he could spare, sending money to bring his brothers from Pennsylvania, and eventually accumulating the $600 needed to purchase the war-damaged farm. The property had represented everything Samuel believed America could offer: stability, dignity, and the chance to build something lasting for future generations. He'd chosen the location carefully, within walking distance of the growing town of New Liberty, in a community that was attracting other Union veterans and families looking to heal from the nation's bitter divisions. 3 generations of the Holloway family had lived in the house, each adding their own improvements and memories. Samuel had repaired the bullet-damaged walls and replaced the missing windows. Richard's grandfather, William Holloway, had modernized the plumbing and electrical systems during the 1940s, installing indoor plumbing and converting from oil lamps to electric lighting. Richard's father, James Holloway, had added the sun porch where he and Margaret had spent countless summer evenings watching fireflies rise from the meadow, sharing stories about their days and planning for their retirement. Richard himself had lovingly restored the original hardwood floors, rebuilt the stone fireplace, and carefully preserved the home's historic character while making it comfortable for modern living. He'd talked constantly about the projects he planned to complete once he retired: restoring the original front porch columns, rebuilding the stone walls that defined the property boundaries, and finally organizing his extensive collection of Civil War artifacts that he'd accumulated over decades of metal detecting and attending historical society auctions. Mrs. Holloway, my dad says there might be emergency assistance programs for flood victims. Ben suggested, not unkindly. Maybe the county has resources you haven't tried yet? Margaret shook her head, having already explored every available option with the thoroughness of someone fighting for survival. I've called everyone, Ben. FEMA says this doesn't qualify as a federal disaster because it's not widespread enough. The county says their emergency funds are exhausted from the flooding in Westridge last fall. The Historical Society can provide documentation of the home's significance, but not funding for repairs. And my insurance. She gestured helplessly at the water surrounding them. Apparently, this kind of flooding isn't covered under my policy. The insurance situation was particularly maddening. Richard had always been meticulous about maintaining their homeowner's policy, reading every clause and ensuring they had adequate coverage. But the fine print contained exclusions that neither of them had fully understood. The policy covered flooding from natural water sources like rivers and streams, but specifically excluded flooding caused by groundwater seepage or foundation issues. The county engineer who'd visited the property had determined that while the creek flooding had initiated the problem, the continuing water intrusion was coming from underground springs that had been activated by the saturated soil, creating a legal loophole that left Margaret without coverage for exactly the kind of disaster she was facing. She'd spent hours on the phone with the insurance company, explaining the situation to representatives who seemed sympathetic but powerless to help. The claims adjuster who'd visited the house had been apologetic, but firm groundwater seepage was explicitly excluded from standard homeowners' policies. If Margaret had wanted that kind of protection, she would have needed to purchase separate groundwater insurance, which cost hundreds of dollars annually and had a 30-day waiting period before taking effect. The county inspector is coming back tomorrow morning, Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion. If this basement isn't dry and the electrical system isn't certified safe, they'll condemn the house. After that, it's just a matter of time until demolition. She'd met the inspector twice already, a tired-looking man named Frank Wilson, who'd been doing this job for 20 years and had seen every kind of housing disaster Virginia could produce. Wilson had been professional but clear about the stakes. The county couldn't allow people to live in houses with compromised electrical systems and ongoing flooding. If Margaret couldn't remediate the problems within the specified time frame, the house would be declared uninhabitable and scheduled for demolition. The prospect of demolition was almost worse than losing the house to foreclosure. At least with foreclosure, the house might be sold to someone who could afford to restore it. With condemnation and demolition, 5 generations of Holloway family history would be reduced to rubble and hauled away in dumpsters. The neighborhood was already changing, with developers buying up older properties and replacing them with modern homes that sold for 3 times what the original residents could afford. Ben stopped working with the pump and looked at Margaret with the kind of sympathy that only comes from growing up in a community where everyone knows everyone else's struggles. Mrs. Holloway, there has to be something we can do. This house is part of the county's history. My dad says it's one of the only pre-Civil War structures left in the area. Margaret appreciated his optimism, but she understood the harsh realities of county bureaucracy better than a 20-year-old could. New Liberty County was dealing with aging infrastructure throughout its rural communities, struggling with limited budgets and an overwhelming number of problems that needed attention. Condemning flood-damaged houses was often easier and cheaper than helping homeowners navigate the complex process of restoration, especially when those homeowners lacked the financial resources to hire lawyers or advocate effectively for themselves. The neighborhood had been changing rapidly since Richard's death. 4 historic homes within a mile of Willow Creek Farm had been sold to developers in the past 2 years, torn down and replaced with larger modern constructions that looked completely out of place among the historic homes that had defined the area for over 2 centuries. Margaret had watched the bulldozers and construction crews with a growing sense of unease, understanding that each demolition made it easier for the county to approve the next one. Richard always said there was something unusual about this foundation. Margaret said, looking around at the submerged basement where her husband had spent countless hours, cataloging his collection of Civil War artifacts. He claimed there was something different about how the house was positioned, something strange about the stone walls. She'd heard Richard make these comments many times over their 42 years of marriage, but she'd never paid much attention to his theories about 18th century building techniques. Richard had been fascinated by American history, particularly the Civil War's impact on the Shenandoah Valley, and he often saw historical significance in places where Margaret saw only old houses and outdated infrastructure. He'd spent years researching the history of their property, collecting old maps and photographs that showed how the area had evolved from frontier settlement to battleground to farmland. Richard had been particularly intrigued by the basement's construction, which seemed more elaborate than necessary for a simple farmhouse foundation. The stone walls were built with a precision typically found in military or public construction, using carefully fitted limestone blocks rather than the rough fieldstone common in residential foundations of the era. The ceiling was unusually high, nearly 10 feet, and the floor had been laid with thick slate tiles that suggested the space had been designed for heavy use. Different how? Ben asked, genuinely curious and perhaps hoping to distract himself from the discouraging reality of their situation. He always said the basement was too deep for a house built in 1789, that some of the stonework looked more like military construction than residential. Margaret explained, her voice taking on some of the enthusiasm that Richard had always brought to his historical investigations. Richard thought the house might have been built on the foundation of an older structure, maybe something connected to a militia outpost or early defensive position. The theory wasn't entirely far-fetched. The Shenandoah Valley had been strategically important during multiple conflicts, from the French and Indian War through the Revolutionary War and especially during the Civil War. Many residential structures had been built on land that had previously housed military or defensive operations, often incorporating foundations or structural elements from earlier buildings. Richard had spent considerable time researching the property's history, visiting the county recorder's office to examine old deeds and tax records. He discovered that the land had been owned by the Virginia militia from 1775 to 1789, used as part of their defensive line before being sold for residential development. The original deed for their house, dated 1789, made reference to existing stone foundations and defensive works, suggesting that Joshua Wilkins, the original owner, had indeed built his house on the remains of an earlier structure. Mrs. Holloway, what if he was right? Ben asked, his youthful enthusiasm beginning to overcome the grim realities of their situation. What if there's something down here that could help with the county? Like, if the house has historical significance, maybe there are preservation grants or something. Margaret understood what he was suggesting, but she also understood that historical significance wouldn't pay for flood remediation or electrical repairs. Ben, even if Richard was right about the basement's history, that doesn't solve our immediate problem. I need dry floors and working electricity, not historical curiosities. But even as she said it, Margaret found herself looking more carefully at the basement's construction. The water level had dropped slightly since they'd started pumping, revealing stone walls that did seem unusually sophisticated for a residential foundation. The stonework was precise and professional, with carefully fitted joints and what appeared to be iron reinforcement rods set into the mortar. The construction was more like what she'd seen in photographs of 18th century military structures, forts, armories, and defensive positions built to withstand attack. Richard had pointed out these details many times, but Margaret had always been focused on more practical concerns, like keeping the house clean and managing their budget. Now, facing the loss of everything they'd built together, she found herself paying attention to the things that had fascinated her husband. Maybe we should focus on getting this water out first, then worry about historical mysteries, she said, trying to redirect Ben's attention to the practical challenges they faced while simultaneously wondering if Richard's theories might somehow be relevant to their current crisis. They worked in relative silence for the next hour, taking turns operating the pump and hauling buckets of water up the basement stairs. The work was exhausting and seemingly endless. For every bucket they removed, more water seemed to seep in from somewhere, not enough to raise the level significantly, but enough to make their progress frustratingly slow. Margaret's back ached from the constant lifting and carrying, and her hands were raw from gripping the bucket handles. The basement held decades of accumulated memories, and watching them float in the murky water was heartbreaking. Margaret saw her wedding dress, carefully preserved in a garment bag that was now soaked through. Richard's army uniform from his brief service in the 1970s floated past, along with the flag that had covered his father's coffin. Photo albums chronicling their life together bobbed like small boats, their pages probably ruined beyond salvage. Most painful were the remnants of Richard's Civil War collection, the hobby that had brought him so much joy during their marriage. His restored Union Army haversacks were scattered throughout the water, their carefully preserved canvas now waterlogged and stained. His collection of mini balls, buttons, and belt buckles, painstakingly organized in display cases, was now a jumbled mess. His books on Civil War history, some rare first editions he'd acquired over decades of collecting, were probably destroyed beyond recovery. Richard had spent years building his collection, attending auctions and relic shows, corresponding with other Civil War enthusiasts, and metal detecting on historically significant properties throughout the Shenandoah Valley. He had dreamed of eventually donating his collection to the Virginia Historical Society, believing that these artifacts represented an important part of American history that deserved to be preserved. Now most of it would end up in dumpsters, another casualty of the flooding that threatened to take everything Margaret had left. As the afternoon light began to fade, Margaret realized that they'd made minimal progress. The water level had dropped perhaps 8 inches, but the basement was still largely flooded, and the electrical systems remained dangerously submerged. The furnace, water heater, and electrical panel were all below the waterline, creating safety hazards that would need to be addressed before the house could be considered habitable again. With less than 60 hours remaining until the county's deadline, Margaret was beginning to accept that the house she'd called home for over 4 decades was about to be lost forever. The arithmetic was brutal and unavoidable. She simply didn't have the money to hire professional water removal services, replace the damaged electrical systems, and address all the other issues that would need to be resolved to satisfy the county's requirements. She thought about Samuel Holloway, the Union veteran who'd purchased this property after surviving the bloodiest conflict in American history, seeing it as his family's foothold in a new era of peace. She thought about William Holloway, who'd raised 4 children here during the Great Depression and World War II, somehow managing to keep the family together despite economic hardships that dwarfed her current problems. She thought about Richard, who'd loved this house and its history, so much that he'd spent his retirement years researching the property and collecting artifacts that celebrated its heritage. "Mrs. Holloway," Ben said, his voice strained from the physical labor, "I think there's something you need to see." He was standing near the far corner of the basement, where the receding water had revealed what appeared to be a section of floor. That didn't match the rest of the basement. The stone pattern was different, where most of the floor was laid with uniform slate tiles. This area showed a rectangular outline of different stones fitted together in a way that suggested they could be removed. Margaret waded over to where Ben was standing, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The rectangular outline was clearly artificial, about 7 feet long and 4 feet wide, with stones that were noticeably different from the surrounding foundation. The joints around the rectangle were filled with a different type of mortar, suggesting that this section had been installed or modified separately from the original construction. "Richard was right," she said quietly, her voice filled with wonder and growing excitement she hadn't felt since before her husband's death. "There is something unusual about this basement." Ben knelt in the shallow water, running his hands along the edges of the rectangular outline. "Mrs. Holloway, this looks like some kind of access panel or trapdoor. Maybe there's a room or storage area underneath." Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. Richard had always insisted that their basement held secrets, that the elaborate construction suggested purposes beyond simple residential storage. If he was right, if there was indeed a hidden space beneath their foundation, it might contain something that could help with their current crisis: historical artifacts, documents, or even structural evidence that could qualify the house for preservation programs. But she also understood that discovering hidden rooms in her basement wouldn't solve the immediate problem of flood damage and electrical hazards. Whatever was beneath those stones had been there for decades, possibly over 2 centuries. It would still be there after the county condemned her house and scheduled it for demolition. "Ben, even if there's something down there, I don't see how it helps us," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Despite her practical concerns, she found herself hoping that Richard's theories might somehow provide the miracle she desperately needed. "Mrs. Holloway, what if it's something valuable? Something historical that could be worth money or get the house declared a landmark?" Ben's youthful optimism was infectious, even in their dire circumstances. Margaret looked at the mysterious rectangular outline in her basement floor, then at the condemnation notice in her pocket that would make her the first generation of Holloways to lose the family home. The flooding crisis that had seemed like an insurmountable disaster was about to reveal secrets that Richard had suspected but never proven. And with less than 60 hours remaining before the county's final inspection, whatever was hidden beneath her basement floor might be the only thing standing between Margaret and the loss of 5 generations of family history. The failing house that had seemed like an unbearable burden was about to reveal secrets that would change everything Margaret thought she knew about her family's home, her region's history, and the Civil War heritage that Richard had spent his retirement years trying to understand and preserve. Margaret's hands trembled as she and Ben worked to clear the remaining water from around the mysterious rectangular outline in her basement floor. The January evening had settled in completely now, and the single work light Ben had brought cast eerie shadows across the stone walls that Richard had always insisted held secrets. What they were about to uncover would either vindicate her late husband's theories about their home's hidden history or prove to be another heartbreaking dead end in her desperate fight to save the house. "Mrs. Holloway, these stones definitely move," Ben said, his voice tight with excitement and effort as he worked his fingers around the edges of the rectangular section. "Look, this whole section is separate from the rest of the floor. It's like a trap door that's been fitted into place." The stones that formed the rectangular outline were indeed different from the surrounding basement floor. Where the regular foundation used uniform slate tiles laid in a standard pattern, this section consisted of carefully cut limestone blocks fitted together with precision that spoke of professional military construction. The mortar around the edges was a different color and texture, suggesting it had been installed or modified at a different time than the original foundation. Margaret knelt beside Ben in the shallow water that remained, running her fingers along the joints between the stones. Richard had been right about so many things regarding their house's construction, and now she was beginning to understand why he'd spent so many evenings down here, measuring walls and examining stonework with the intensity of an archaeologist. The evidence had been here all along, hidden beneath decades of accumulated storage and family life. "Richard always said the basement was built like a military structure," she murmured, more to herself than to Ben. "He used to joke that our house was sitting on top of some kind of Civil War bunker, but I never took him seriously." The theory had seemed like one of Richard's harmless obsessions, the kind of historical speculation that history enthusiasts love to pursue but that had little bearing on practical daily life. Margaret had always been focused on more immediate concerns, managing their household budget, maintaining the house's appearance, and later caring for Richard during his illness. She'd never had time for theories about 18th century construction, techniques, or the military history of their property. But now, faced with the loss of everything they'd built together, Margaret found herself desperately hoping that Richard's theories might somehow provide the salvation she needed. If the house did indeed sit on historically significant foundations, there might be preservation programs or heritage designations that could protect it from condemnation and demolition. "How do we get these stones up?" Ben asked, examining the tight joints between the limestone blocks. Margaret looked around the basement for tools that might help with their investigation. Most of Richard's workshop equipment was either submerged or damaged by the flooding, but she spotted his old pry bar hanging on a pegboard that had remained above the waterline. The tool was rusty but solid, a remnant from Richard's days, renovating historic properties when he'd used similar equipment to remove old flooring and expose original construction. "Let's try this," she said, retrieving the pry bar and handing it to Ben. "But be careful. If there's really something underneath here, we don't want to damage it." Ben positioned the pry bar along the edge of one of the limestone blocks, working carefully to avoid scarring the stone or damaging whatever might lie beneath. The first block resisted his efforts, held in place by over 2 centuries of settled mortar and the weight of the stones above it. But as he applied steady pressure, Margaret could see the mortar beginning to crumble. "It's working," Ben said, his voice strained with effort. "I can feel it starting to move." The first stone came free with a grinding sound that echoed through the basement like a door opening after centuries of disuse. Beneath the limestone block was a dark space that seemed to extend further down than either of them had expected. Ben shone his flashlight into the opening, revealing what appeared to be a carefully constructed chamber beneath their basement floor. "Mrs. Holloway, there's definitely a room down there," Ben said, his excitement now completely overriding any concerns about the practical problems they'd been trying to solve. "And it looks dry, completely dry." Margaret's heart raced as she peered into the opening Ben had created. The chamber below was indeed real, not just another of Richard's historical theories. The space extended at least 8 feet in each direction, with stone walls that matched the professional construction of the basement above. But what made her gasp was the realization that the chamber wasn't empty. "Ben, there's something down there." "Several things, actually." They worked feverishly to remove more of the limestone blocks, driven by a mixture of curiosity and the desperate hope that whatever lay hidden beneath her basement might somehow help with Margaret's dire situation. Each stone they removed revealed more of the chamber below, and with each revelation, it became clear that Richard had been absolutely right about their house's unusual history. The chamber was approximately 15 feet long and 10 feet wide, with a vaulted stone ceiling that demonstrated the same professional construction techniques Margaret had noticed in the basement walls. The space had been carefully sealed and appeared to have remained dry despite the flooding above, protected by engineering that had withstood the test of centuries. But what dominated the chamber were objects that neither Margaret nor Ben had been prepared to find. "Mrs. Holloway," Ben whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Those are Civil War ammunition crates, dozens of them." The objects in the chamber were indeed wooden ammunition crates, stacked neatly against the walls in precise rows. These weren't modern reproductions. They were authentic 19th century military supplies, with faded stenciled markings still visible on their wooden surfaces. The crates were constructed of solid oak with iron reinforcements, designed to transport and protect munitions during the chaotic conditions of Civil War battlefields. But the ammunition crate's presence in the chamber raised immediate questions. that neither Margaret nor Ben could answer. How had such a large cache of Civil War munitions ended up in a hidden room beneath a residential house? When had it been placed there and why? And perhaps most importantly, what did the crates contain that required such elaborate concealment? "This is impossible," Margaret said, though the evidence before her eyes made denial difficult. "How does someone hide an entire ammunition depot beneath a private home? And why would anyone do such a thing?" Ben was already climbing down into the chamber, his youthful fearlessness overcoming any concerns about the safety or wisdom of exploring the hidden space. "Mrs. Holloway, you need to see this. There's more than just ammunition crates. There are documents, maps, and what looks like, well, I'm not sure what else." Margaret's practical caution warred with her growing excitement about what they'd discovered. The chamber had clearly been sealed for centuries, possibly since the Civil War itself, and there was no immediate danger in exploring it. But she also understood that whatever they found down there would complicate her already desperate situation with the county housing authority. "Be careful, Ben," she called, as she lowered herself into the chamber using the wooden ladder that had apparently been installed when the space was originally constructed. "We don't know how stable anything is down here." The chamber felt remarkably dry, and well-preserved considering its age and the flooding that had affected the basement above. The walls showed evidence of careful waterproofing with what appeared to be tar or pitch applied to the stone surfaces to prevent moisture infiltration. The floor was paved with the same limestone blocks they'd removed from the access panel, creating a stable surface that had clearly been designed to support heavy military equipment. But it was the ammunition crates themselves that commanded their attention. The wooden sides of the crates were marked with faded paint that had once identified their contents and military unit. Margaret could make out partial lettering that appeared to spell Union Army Ordnance and what looked like regimental designations, though the paint was too faded to read completely. "Mrs. Holloway, look at this," Ben said, pointing to one of the crates that was partially open. "These aren't just ammunition, there's money here too." Margaret approached the crate with growing amazement. Inside were rows of what appeared to be gold and silver coins, stacked in neat piles and protected by oilcloth wrappings that had preserved them in pristine condition. Each stack was labeled with handwritten tags identifying amounts and sources. "Ben, these are Civil War-era gold eagles and silver dollars," she said, examining one of the coins with trembling fingers. "This is Union Army payroll money." The discovery of currency alongside ammunition raised even more questions. Military payrolls were typically kept separate from munitions for security reasons. The combination suggested something beyond standard military operations, perhaps a covert operation or emergency evacuation of valuable supplies. Margaret moved deeper into the chamber, examining the other contents with growing amazement. Along one wall were wooden document boxes containing what appeared to be military orders, maps, and correspondence. The papers were yellowed with age, but had been remarkably preserved in the dry, sealed environment. One document caught her eye immediately, a handwritten letter dated April 8, 1865. Just one day before General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The letter was signed by a Colonel James Montgomery of the Union Army's Quartermaster Corps and addressed to a Lieutenant William Holloway. "Ben," Margaret gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. William Holloway was Richard's great-grandfather. The letter detailed emergency instructions for the protection of valuable military supplies in the face of Confederate General Jubal Early's troops, who were conducting last-ditch raids throughout the Shenandoah Valley, even as the war was ending. Colonel Montgomery had ordered Lieutenant Holloway to secure a significant cache of ammunition and payroll funds in a hidden location away from main roads and obvious military targets. "Lieutenant Holloway," the letter read, "you are hereby ordered to secure the enclosed supplies at the location we discussed. The ammunition must not fall into enemy hands, and the payroll funds must be protected at all costs. The Republic has invested too much blood and treasure in this valley to lose these resources in the final days of this conflict. When victory is assured, retrieve these materials for proper disbursement. Should you fall in the line of duty, this letter shall serve as proof of your honorable service in this vital mission. The letter continued with specific inventory details: 48 crates of rifle ammunition, 16 crates of artillery shells, 12 crates of percussion caps, and payroll funds totaling $28,000 in gold and silver coinage, an enormous sum in 1865 equivalent to millions in today's currency. Mrs. Holloway, your husband's family didn't just live in this house, Ben said, the significance of the discovery dawning on him. They were directly involved in hiding Union Army supplies during the Civil War. Margaret's mind raced with the implications. The historical narrative she'd heard about Samuel Holloway purchasing the property after the war was only part of the story. It seemed that William Holloway, perhaps Samuel's father or uncle, had been entrusted with protecting vital military resources, and had chosen this property with its existing stone foundation and defensible position as the perfect hiding place. But the documents revealed something even more significant. Another letter, this one dated June 17, 1865, after the war had officially ended, indicated that Colonel Montgomery had been killed in one of the final skirmishes of the conflict. The chain of command had been disrupted, and Lieutenant Holloway had never received official orders to retrieve and return the hidden supplies. With Montgomery dead and military units rapidly disbanding as soldiers returned home, the official records of the hidden cache had apparently been lost in the chaotic aftermath of the war. That's why Samuel Holloway bought this property after the war, Margaret realized. He or his family knew about the hidden supplies and wanted to ensure they remained protected. The discovery explained why the house had remained in the Holloway family for generations, passed down with what must have been a secret understanding of what lay beneath its foundation. It also explained Richard's fascination with the basement's construction. Perhaps family stories or documents had hinted at the hidden chamber, though the exact location had been lost over generations until the flood had helped reveal its existence. But the discovery also created new complications for Margaret's already desperate situation. Finding military artifacts, even artifacts that were over 150 years old, raised legal questions that she wasn't equipped to handle. Did these materials still belong to the U.S. government? Did Margaret have any legal claim to items found on her own property? And perhaps most importantly, could she use this discovery to save her house without getting herself into legal trouble? Mrs. Holloway, this is incredible, Ben said, carefully examining one of the ammunition crates. This has to be one of the most significant Civil War discoveries in decades. Museums would be fighting over this collection. Margaret looked around the underground chamber that had been hidden beneath her basement for over a century, and Margaret looked around the underground chamber that had been hidden beneath her basement for over a century, and about half at the ammunition crates that represented one of the most substantial Civil War era finds in recent history, at the coins and documents that told a story of loyalty, duty, and the chaos of war's end. This wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was tangible evidence of her family's direct connection to a pivotal moment in American history. Ben, I need to think about what to do next, she said, her voice steadier than she would have expected. Given the magnitude of their discovery, this isn't just about saving my house anymore. This is about preserving a piece of history that's been hidden for generations. They carefully explored more of the chamber, documenting its contents with Ben's smartphone camera. The ammunition crates appeared to be sealed and intact, their contents preserved by the craftsmanship of 19th century military carpentry. The payroll money, gold eagles, silver dollars, and even some paper currency had been protected from moisture and decay by careful wrapping and the chamber's remarkable environmental stability. Along with the military supplies, They found personal items that must have belonged to Lieutenant William Holloway, a pocket watch, a daguerreotype photograph of a young woman, and a journal that detailed his experiences during the final days of the Civil War. The journal entries stopped abruptly in May 1865, leaving unanswered questions about what had happened to the lieutenant after the war's end. As they cataloged the chamber's contents, Margaret found herself thinking not just about the historical significance of their discovery, but about its potential to save her home from condemnation. The financial value of authentic Civil War artifacts, especially in such quantity and condition, was substantial. Museums, historical societies, and private collectors would likely pay considerable sums for such well-preserved items with clear provenance. But there were ethical considerations as well. These weren't just collectibles. They were historical artifacts that told an important story about the Civil War's impact on the Shenandoah Valley and the responsibilities entrusted to individual soldiers in times of national crisis. Simply selling them to the highest bidder would mean losing the context that made them truly valuable from a historical perspective. "Ben, we need to be careful about how we proceed," Margaret said as they prepared to climb back up to the basement. "This discovery needs to be properly documented and preserved. These aren't just old things, they're pieces of American history." Ben nodded, his engineering student's mind already thinking about practical solutions. "We should contact Dr. Layton at the university's history department. He specializes in Civil War history and would know the proper procedures for documenting something like this." Margaret agreed that expert guidance was essential, but she was also acutely aware of the ticking clock. The county inspector was due in less than 2 days, and finding Civil War artifacts wouldn't automatically stop the condemnation process. She needed to leverage this discovery quickly if it was going to save her home. As they climbed back into the flooded basement, Margaret felt a strange mixture of emotions: excitement about their incredible find, anxiety about her home's uncertain future, and a growing sense of responsibility toward the historical legacy that had been hidden beneath her feet for generations. Richard had been right all along about the house's secrets, and now it was up to her to honor both his memory and the historical significance of what they'd discovered. "Ben, can you stay a bit longer?" she asked as they emerged into the basement. "I need to make some calls, and I could use your help explaining what we've found." Ben's enthusiastic nod told her everything she needed to know. The young engineering student was now fully invested in the mystery they'd uncovered, his initial offer of neighborly help having transformed into partnership in what might be one of the most significant historical discoveries in Virginia's recent memory. Margaret made her way upstairs to her kitchen phone, water dripping from her clothes onto the worn linoleum floor. With less than 48 hours remaining before the county's deadline, she had to move quickly. Her first call would be to Dr. James Layton at the University of Virginia's History Department, a leading expert on Civil War history in the Shenandoah Valley who had occasionally corresponded with Richard about local historical sites. Her second call would be to Sarah Brennan, a local attorney who specialized in property law and historic preservation. Margaret would need legal guidance to navigate the complicated questions of ownership, historical preservation requirements, and negotiation with county authorities. As she dialed Dr. Layton's number, Margaret glanced at the photograph of Richard that sat on her kitchen counter husband in his favorite fishing hat, smiling widely during their last vacation to the Blue Ridge Mountains before his diagnosis. She could almost hear his excited voice discussing the historical theories that had now been proven correct. "You were right, Richard," she whispered as the phone began to ring. "You were right about everything." The hidden chamber beneath Willow Creek Farm was about to transform Margaret's desperate fight to save her home into something much larger, race to preserve a unique piece of Civil War history that had remained untouched for over a century and a half. The ammunition and payroll cash that Lieutenant William Holloway had hidden in the final days of America's bloodiest conflict was about to see the light of day again. revealing secrets that connected Margaret's personal struggle with the broader currents of American history. With Ben's help and Richard's spiritual presence guiding her, Margaret prepared to make her case to experts who could help authenticate and preserve their remarkable discovery. The flooding crisis that had threatened to destroy her home had led to a historical find that might just save it, if she could navigate the complex intersection of historical preservation, property rights, and county regulations in the limited time she had left. Dr. James Layton arrived at Willow Creek Farm at precisely 8:30 the following morning, just 35 hours before the county's final deadline. The Civil War historian from the University of Virginia was a tall man in his 60s with a silver beard and the energetic demeanor of someone who had spent decades bringing history to life for his students. Sarah Brennan, the property lawyer Margaret had contacted, arrived shortly afterward, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, whose reputation for protecting historic properties from development had made her something of a local hero in preservation circles. "Mrs. Holloway, when you called, I thought perhaps you'd found a few mini balls or a belt buckle," Dr. Layton said as Margaret led them down into the basement. "What you're describing is potentially one of the most significant Civil War discoveries in the region in the last 50 years. The basement was still damp, but Ben and his father John had worked through the night with additional pumps borrowed from neighbors. The water level had receded enough to fully expose the stone trapdoor and make the basement navigable without wading. The limestone blocks they'd removed were stacked neatly to one side, and the opening provided clear access to what Dr. Layton immediately recognized as a professionally constructed military storage facility. "My God," the historian whispered, as he peered down into the chamber. "This is authentic Union Army construction textbook Corps of Engineers work from the middle period of the war." Sarah Brennan was more focused on the immediate legal implications of the discovery. "Margaret, before we go any further, I need to make sure you understand the complexity of your situation. What you've found here has significant historical value, but there are complicated questions of ownership and preservation requirements that we'll need to address." The three adults and Ben descended into the chamber, where Dr. Layton immediately began examining the ammunition crates and documents with the methodical precision of a professional historian. He photographed everything, carefully handled the papers with cotton gloves he'd brought in his bag, and took detailed notes about the military markings on the crates. "The historical significance of this find cannot be overstated," Dr. Layton explained as he examined a letter from Colonel Montgomery to Lieutenant Holloway. "This cache represents a previously undocumented strategic decision in the final days of the Valley Campaign. The military leadership was clearly concerned about Confederate raids even as the war was ending, and took extraordinary measures to protect these supplies." Dr. Layton's research specialty was precisely this period, the final months of the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley, when Union forces under General Philip Sheridan had secured the region but continued to face guerrilla raids from Confederate units unwilling to surrender. The hidden cache provided physical evidence of military decisions that had previously been known only through fragmentary written records. "This letter changes our understanding of how Union forces managed logistics during the war's final phase," Dr. Layton continued, his excitement evident as he connected Margaret's discovery to the broader sweep of American history. "We've always known that Union quartermasters took steps to protect supplies from raids, but the scale of this operation and the fact that it involved such a large amount of payroll funds suggests a level of strategic planning that wasn't previously documented." The discovery of Lieutenant William Holloway's journal was particularly significant. The daily entries detailed not just military movements and supply management, but the personal experiences of a Union officer tasked with an extraordinary responsibility during the chaotic period. The journal provided insights into the human dimensions of war that formal military records often missed. "From a legal standpoint," Sarah Brennan added, "this discovery has several implications. The Antiquities Act and various historical preservation laws potentially apply to artifacts of this significance. However, the fact that these items were found on private property that has been in your family's continuous ownership since shortly after the war strengthens your position considerably. The lawyer had already begun formulating strategies to leverage the discovery to protect Margaret's home from condemnation. Historic preservation laws at both the state and federal levels provided protection for properties with demonstrated historical significance, potentially overriding local housing code enforcement in certain circumstances. The most immediate step, Sarah advised, is to secure an emergency historical designation for the property. Virginia's Historic Resources Department can fast-track the process given the significance of this find and the imminent threat to the property. Dr. Layton nodded in agreement. I can contact the department director personally. We've worked together on several preservation projects, and he understands the importance of acting quickly when significant sites are threatened. As they continued examining the chamber and its contents, Margaret found herself experiencing a profound sense of connection to the past. The hidden room wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was tangible, evidence of her family's role in a pivotal moment in American history. William Holloway hadn't just been a Union officer. He had been entrusted with protecting vital military resources during one of the nation's most vulnerable periods. Dr. Layton, Margaret asked, what do you think happened to Lieutenant Holloway after the war? Why didn't he retrieve these supplies when the fighting ended? The historian examined the journal entries carefully. The final entry is dated May 12, 1865, about a month after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Holloway mentions receiving news of Lincoln's assassination and expresses concern about the chaos in the command structure, with Colonel Montgomery killed. Inaction and the military rapidly demobilizing, Holloway may have been waiting for orders that never came. This explanation aligned with what they knew about the chaotic aftermath of the Civil War. As the massive Union Army disbanded, paperwork was lost, command chains dissolved, and soldiers focused on returning to civilian life. The hidden cash, intended as a temporary security measure, had apparently been forgotten and the confusion remembered only as a family secret passed down through generations of Holloways who built their lives above this chamber, without fully understanding its contents. There's something else we need to consider, Sarah Brennan said, examining one of the gold coins. The monetary value of these artifacts is substantial. The gold and silver alone, at current precious metal prices, would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Add the historical premium for Civil War artifacts in this condition, and we're potentially looking at millions. The financial implications weren't lost on Margaret. The value of the discovery could solve all her immediate problems and secure her future. But she also understood that simply selling the artifacts for their monetary value would mean losing the historical context that made them truly significant. I don't want to just sell these items to the highest bidder, Margaret said firmly. Richard would have wanted them preserved properly, kept together as a collection that tells this story. Dr. Layton nodded approvingly. That's the approach I'd recommend from a historical perspective. This cache isn't just a collection of valuable objects, it's a complete historical record of a specific military operation. Breaking it up would diminish its scholarly value enormously. The historian suggested a partnership with a major museum or historical society that could properly preserve, study, and display the collection while providing Margaret with fair compensation for the artifacts. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, the Virginia Historical Society, or the American Civil War Museum would all have the resources and expertise to handle a discovery of this magnitude. As they discussed options, Ben, who had been quietly examining the ammunition crates, made another discovery. Mrs. Holloway, Dr. Layton, there's something else here, he called from the far corner of the chamber. Behind these crates, there's a small alcove with more documents. The hidden alcove contained what appeared to be personal correspondence letters between Lieutenant William Holloway and his family, including a woman named Elizabeth, who was presumably his wife or fiancée. The letters painted a poignant picture of a young officer struggling with the moral complexities of war while trying to maintain connections to the life he hoped to return to. One letter in particular caught Margaret's attention. Dated April 14, 1865, the day of Lincoln's assassination. Though William wouldn't have known it, yet the lieutenant wrote to Elizabeth about his plans for after the war. When this conflict is finally behind us, I intend to secure a parcel of land in this valley. Despite the destruction war has brought, I have come to appreciate the beauty of these mountains and the potential of this soil. The property where I have secured our materials has a fine stone foundation that could support a proper home, and the position offers views of both sunrise and sunset that would bring joy to any family fortunate enough to dwell there. Perhaps Providence has led me to the very place where we might build our future together. Margaret read the words aloud, her voice catching with emotion. He was already planning to make this his home, even before the war ended. It appears that Lieutenant Holloway had already formed an attachment to this specific property, Dr. Layton observed. When Samuel Holloway purchased it after the war, he may have been fulfilling his father's or brother's expressed wish. This personal connection transformed Margaret's understanding of her family's relationship to the property. Willow Creek Farm hadn't just been a random purchase. It had been specifically chosen by a Holloway who had discovered it while performing his military duty, who had seen in this place the potential for the family legacy that had indeed followed. As they carefully documented the chamber's contents, Sarah Brennan received a phone call from her contact at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. The news was promising based on Dr. Layton's preliminary report and the photographs they'd sent. The department was preparing to issue an emergency historic designation for the property that would temporarily protect it from condemnation. They'll need to send an official assessment team, Sarah explained after ending the call, but they're willing to issue a 30-day emergency stay on any county action while they complete their evaluation. That should give us the time we need to address the flooding issues properly. The emergency designation wouldn't solve all of Margaret's problems. She would still need to repair the damage and bring the house up to code. But it would prevent the immediate threat of demolition and potentially qualify the property for preservation grants and tax incentives that could help finance the necessary work. Dr. Layton's contacts had been equally productive. The historian had spoken with colleagues at both the Smithsonian and the American Civil War Museum, and both institutions had expressed immediate interest in the discovery. The museum representatives were prepared to send authentication teams as soon as possible, and preliminary discussions suggested they would be willing to provide substantial compensation for the collection. These institutions understand the significance of keeping the collection intact, Dr. Layton explained. They're prepared to offer appropriate compensation that recognizes both the monetary and historical value of these artifacts. As the morning progressed, Ben's father John arrived with additional neighbors who had heard about the discovery. The close-knit community of New Liberty had mobilized to help, bringing additional pumps to clear the remaining water from the basement, providing food for the growing team of people working at the house, and offering their own specialized skills to address the immediate practical problems. Tom Jenkins, a retired electrician who lived 3 houses down, volunteered to inspect and repair the electrical system once the basement was fully dry. Maria Gonzalez, who worked as a contractor specializing in historic renovations, offered to help assess the structural damage and develop a restoration plan that would preserve the home's historic character while addressing the county's safety concerns. The community response reminded Margaret of stories Richard had told about barn raisings and harvest assistance that had characterized rural Virginia in earlier generations, neighbors coming together to ensure that no one in the community faced disaster alone. In the midst of her personal crisis, she was discovering that the support networks that had sustained families for generations in this valley were still alive and functional. By early afternoon, the basement was almost completely dry, and Tom Jenkins had begun the process of evaluating the electrical damage. His initial assessment was more positive than Margaret had dared hope. While some wiring would need to be replaced, the main electrical panel could be salvaged, significantly reducing the cost of repairs. Frank Wilson, the county inspector, called to inform Margaret that he had received notification of the emergency historic designation and would be postponing his final inspection until the state's assessment team had completed their evaluation. The tone of his voice suggested that the county was recalibrating its approach to her property now that its historical significance had been officially recognized. As Margaret sat at her kitchen table with Dr. Layton, Sarah Brennan, and Ben, reviewing the day's developments and planning next steps, she found herself experiencing a profound shift in perspective. The house that had seemed like an unbearable burden just 24 hours earlier now represented not just her personal home, but a significant piece of American history that deserved preservation. "Margaret," Dr. Layton said, carefully handling Lieutenant Holloway's journal, "I want you to understand what you've discovered here. This isn't just a collection of valuable artifacts. It's a window into a critical moment in our nation's history, preserved with a completeness that historians rarely encounter. Your husband's theories about this property weren't just idle speculation. They were intuitions based on family knowledge that connected him to his ancestors in ways he might not have fully understood." The historian's words resonated deeply with Margaret. Richard's passion for history and preservation hadn't been a mere hobby. It had been an expression of his connection to the generations of Holloways who had lived on this land, who had played a role in the nation's story that was only now being fully revealed. "What happens next?" she asked, looking at Sarah Brennan and Dr. Layton. "How do we balance preserving this discovery with saving my home?" The lawyer and historian exchanged glances, both clearly considering how to present the complex path forward. "The good news," Sarah began, "is that the emergency historic designation gives us breathing room. The county can't move forward with condemnation while the state's assessment is pending. That gives us time to develop a comprehensive preservation and restoration plan." Dr. Layton nodded in agreement. "The museums I've contacted are prepared to move quickly. They understand the unique circumstances and the need to provide timely compensation that can fund the necessary repairs to the property." The historian outlined a potential partnership with the American Civil War Museum that would allow the institution to acquire, preserve, and display the collection while establishing an ongoing relationship with Willow Creek Farm as a satellite historic site. The arrangement would provide immediate financial compensation for the artifacts, while creating a sustainable framework for the property's long-term preservation. They're prepared to offer $750,000 for the collection, Dr. Layton said, with an additional annual stipend of $25,000, if you're willing to allow limited public access to the underground chamber as part of their educational programming. The figure momentarily took Margaret's breath away. It was far more than enough to address the immediate repairs, modernize the home's systems, and provide financial security for her future. The annual stipend would supplement her widow's pension, ensuring she could properly maintain the historic property without financial strain. "And there's more," Sarah added. "With the historic designation, you'll qualify for tax incentives for preservation work and potential grants from both state and federal sources. The Virginia Historic Preservation Foundation has programs specifically designed to help owners of significant properties cover the costs of appropriate restoration." The legal and financial framework they outlined would transform Margaret's situation completely, from the brink of losing her home to a sustainable future as the steward of a historically significant property. The home that had been in Richard's Family for generations would not only be saved, but elevated to its rightful place in the region's historical narrative. As Margaret considered the proposal, she found herself thinking about the generations of Holloways who had lived in this house. From Lieutenant William, who had first identified the property while performing his military duty, to Samuel, who had purchased it after the war, to Richard, who had loved and maintained it throughout their marriage. Each generation had played a role in preserving both the physical structure and the hidden secrets beneath it, whether they fully understood those secrets or not. "I think Richard would approve of this approach," she said finally. "He always said this house had stories to tell. Now those stories will be shared properly, not lost." Ben, who had been quietly listening to the discussion, spoke up with the directness of youth. "Mrs. Holloway, you didn't just save your house, you preserved something that belongs to everyone. That's pretty amazing." His simple observation captured the essence of the transformation that had occurred. What had begun as a desperate fight to save her personal home had evolved into something much larger, the preservation of a unique historical resource that would enhance understanding of the nation's past for generations to come. As the afternoon light filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm patterns on the worn table where Margaret had shared thousands of meals with Richard over their decades together, she felt a profound sense of connection to her late husband, to the generations of Holloways who had lived on this land before them, and to the young lieutenant who had hidden valuable resources beneath this foundation during a nation's darkest hour. The flooding that had threatened to destroy everything she valued had instead revealed treasures of both monetary and historical significance. The disaster that had seemed like the end of her family's legacy had instead unveiled its true importance, in ways she could never have anticipated. "Let's move forward with the museum partnership," Margaret decided. "But I want to make sure we do this right, that the full story is told, including my family's role in preserving this site, intentionally or not, for over 150 years. Dr. Layton nodded approvingly. "That's precisely the approach the museum wants to take. This isn't just about the Civil War artifacts. It's about how ordinary families sometimes become unwitting guardians of history, how the past remains present even when we're unaware of it." As they finalized their plans, Margaret found herself glancing at Richard's photograph on the mantelpiece. His smile seemed different, now not just the familiar expression of the man she'd loved, but the satisfied look of someone whose historical intuitions had been validated, whose connection to the past had proven deeper than even he had realized. The crisis that had brought her to the brink of losing everything had instead revealed connections and resources she had never imagined. The house that had seemed like a burden too heavy to bear had transformed into a bridge between past and future, between personal history and national heritage. With less than 24 hours until what would have been the county's final deadline, Margaret Holloway was no longer a widow struggling to save her home from condemnation. She had become the steward of a historical treasure, the latest in a line of Holloways who had knowingly or unknowingly preserved a unique piece of American history for future generations to study and appreciate. The underground chamber and its contents would soon be professionally preserved and shared with the world. The story of Lieutenant William Holloway and his secret mission would become part of the historical record, and Willow Creek Farm would continue to stand as it had for over 2 centuries, a witness to the nation's evolution and a testament to the unexpected ways in which the past remains present in our lives. The next 72 hours unfolded in a whirlwind of activity that would forever transform Willow Creek Farm from a private family home threatened with demolition into a nationally recognized historic landmark. Dr. Layton worked tirelessly with his museum contacts to expedite the authentication and acquisition process, while Sarah Brennan navigated the complex legal frameworks that would protect the property from both immediate condemnation and future development threats. The American Civil War Museum sent a team of 3 specialists, a military historian, an artifact conservator, and an archival expert who arrived early Wednesday morning to begin the meticulous process of documenting, cataloging, and preparing the collection for eventual transfer. Their initial assessment confirmed what Dr. Layton had already concluded. The hidden cache represented one of the most significant Civil War discoveries in recent decades, both for its completeness and its pristine condition. "Mrs. Holloway," said Dr. Rebecca Carson, the museum's head conservator, as she carefully examined one of the ammunition crates, "the preservation of these materials is nothing short of miraculous. The engineering of this chamber, the waterproofing, the ventilation system, the moisture control shows a level of sophistication that was cutting edge for the 1860s. Lieutenant Holloway and his men weren't just hiding these supplies. They were ensuring their long-term preservation." The military historian, Professor Martin Wells, was equally impressed by the strategic implications of the cache. "This wasn't a hasty emergency measure," he explained while reviewing Lieutenant Holloway's journal. "This was a carefully planned strategic reserve, positioned to support Union operations in the valley through the anticipated final resistance. The inclusion of payroll funds alongside ammunition suggests they were preparing for an extended campaign that would require both military supplies and civilian support." Margaret watched the experts work with a growing appreciation for what her family had unknowingly protected for generations. Each careful measurement, each photograph, each entry in the museum's detailed catalog added to her understanding of the historical significance of what lay beneath her home. The discovery wasn't just valuable in monetary terms. It was an irreplaceable window into a pivotal moment in American history. Meanwhile, the practical work of saving the house proceeded with equal intensity. The emergency historic designation had triggered access to immediate preservation resources. A team of specialists in historic restoration arrived Wednesday afternoon, bringing equipment specifically designed for water removal and structural drying in heritage buildings. Modern industrial dehumidifiers and specialized drying systems were installed throughout the basement, carefully positioned to remove moisture without damaging the historic stonework. Tom Jenkins, the retired electrician from down the street, worked alongside a certified historic preservation electrician to evaluate and repair the home's electrical systems. Their collaborative approach blended Tom's practical knowledge of the house's specific quirks with the specialist's expertise in updating historic wiring to meet modern safety standards while preserving original features. "The good news," Tom told Margaret as they reviewed the electrical assessment, "is that most of the damage is confined to the newer wiring that was added in the 1970s. The original knob and tube system that your father-in-law installed actually held up remarkably well, probably because it was installed with such craftsmanship. We can save more than we initially thought." The community support that had begun with Ben's offer of help had expanded into something approaching an old-fashioned barn raising. Neighbors arrived throughout Wednesday and Thursday, bringing food for the workers, offering specialized skills, and pitching in wherever extra hands were needed. Karen Larson organized a rotation of home-cooked meals. John Larson and his colleagues from the lumber mill helped move furniture and heavy items to facilitate the restoration work. Even Frank Wilson, the county inspector who had initially issued the condemnation notice, stopped by during his lunch break to offer advice on navigating the county's permit process for historic properties. "Mrs. Holloway," Wilson said, his official demeanor softening, "I want you to know that we're not in the business of tearing down history. Our job is public safety, but we're also part of this community. Now that we understand the significance of this property, we want to help make sure it's preserved properly." The county's approach had indeed shifted dramatically. The emergency historic designation had been quickly followed by expressions of support from local officials who recognized both the historical significance of the discovery and its potential economic impact on the region. Tourism related to Civil War history was already a significant economic driver in the Shenandoah Valley. A new historic site would strengthen that industry while bringing positive attention to New Liberty specifically. By Thursday afternoon, with less than 24 hours until what would have been the county's final deadline, the basement was completely dry. The electrical systems had been repaired to meet safety codes, and the restoration team had begun addressing the structural issues caused by the flooding. The immediacy of the crisis had passed, replaced by a coordinated effort to transform Margaret's home into a property that honored both its historical significance and its continued function as her residence. The museum's acquisition offer had been formalized and expanded. In addition to the $750,000 for the collection and the annual stipend for public access to the chamber, the American Civil War Museum had proposed establishing a permanent satellite exhibition space in New Liberty. The museum would purchase a small commercial property in town to house displays contextualizing the Willow Creek farm discovery and providing economic benefits to the broader community. This approach creates a win-win scenario, Sarah Brennan explained as she reviewed the contract with Margaret. The chamber itself remains part of your property, with controlled access for researchers and special tours, while the main visitor facilities will be located separately. You maintain your privacy while still participating in the educational mission. The financial arrangements would transform Margaret's situation completely. The immediate payment would cover all necessary repairs and modernization of the house, with substantial funds remaining for her future security. The annual stipend would supplement her widow's pension, ensuring she could maintain the historic property properly. Additional grant funding for ongoing preservation would be available through both the museum partnership and her property's new designation on the National Register of Historic Places. As Margaret signed the final museum acquisition agreement, Thursday evening, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past 5 days. What had begun as a desperate fight to save her home from condemnation had evolved into something she could never have imagined: the discovery of a nationally significant historical treasure, the establishment of a new historic site, and the transformation of her role from struggling widow to steward of American heritage. "Dr. Layton," she said as she handed the signed agreement to the historian, "do you think Lieutenant William Holloway ever imagined that his actions would have such lasting impact? That the supplies he hid would remain undisturbed for more than 150 years? The historian considered the question thoughtfully. Military men in wartime are usually focused on immediate objectives, winning the next battle, securing the next position. But there's evidence in his journal that William Holloway was thinking beyond the immediate crisis. His descriptions of this valley, his appreciation for the landscape and the community, suggest he was considering the future even in the midst of conflict." Dr. Layton gestured toward the kitchen window where the evening light illuminated the rolling hills that had drawn Lieutenant Holloway to this place a century and a half earlier. In some ways, he was fighting not just to preserve the Union, but to ensure that future generations, including his own descendants, would have the opportunity to build lives in a peaceful, reunited nation. The fact that his great-great-grandson's widow is now ensuring the preservation of his legacy seems fitting. Friday morning dawned clear and crisp, a welcome change from the January rains that had initiated the crisis. Frank Wilson arrived precisely at 9 a.m. for what would have been the final inspection before condemnation. Instead, he was accompanied by the mayor of New Liberty, 2 county commissioners, and a representative from the governor's office, all of whom had requested to witness the official reversal of the condemnation order. The basement that had been a flood-damaged disaster area just 5 days earlier had been transformed. The water was gone, the electrical systems repaired and certified safe, and the foundation issues stabilized. The stone trapdoor leading to the underground chamber had been professionally reinforced and fitted with a secure, historically appropriate access system designed by the museum's preservation architects. Mrs. Holloway, Mayor Elizabeth Ransom said after Wilson had officially rescinded the condemnation notice. On behalf of New Liberty, I want to express our community's gratitude for your decision to preserve this remarkable historical discovery. Your partnership with the American Civil War Museum ensures that an important piece of our regional heritage will be properly maintained and shared with future generations. The mayor's words reflected the dramatic shift in how both officials and neighbors now viewed Willow Creek Farm. What had been seen as a problematic old house with maintenance issues had been revealed as a unique historical resource, a direct connection to pivotal events in the nation's past. Margaret's role had similarly transformed from a property owner struggling to meet code requirements to a valued partner in historical preservation. The governor's representative presented Margaret with an official commendation recognizing her contribution to Virginia's historical heritage and announced that Willow Creek Farm had been fast-tracked for inclusion on the state's Registry of Historic Landmarks. The designation would provide additional legal protections for the property and access to specialized preservation resources. As the officials departed and the activity around the house gradually subsided, Margaret found herself sitting on the back porch with Ben Larson, whose innocent offer of help with a flooded basement had initiated the chain of events that had transformed her life. Mrs. Holloway then said, his engineering student's mind still processing the technical aspects of their discovery, "I've been thinking about the odds of all this happening. If the creek hadn't flooded exactly when it did, if the water hadn't revealed that specific section of floor, if you hadn't remembered Mr. Holloway's theories about the foundation, none of this would have happened. The chamber might have remained hidden for another 100 years." Margaret considered the remarkable sequence of events that had led to their discovery. The disaster that had threatened to take her home had instead revealed its true significance. The financial crisis that had seemed insurmountable had resolved itself through the unveiling of historical treasures. The community that had seemed distant in her grief had rallied around her when she needed support. "I think Richard would say there are no coincidences," she replied, gazing at the rolling hills that had first captured Lieutenant William Holloway's imagination during the turbulent days of the Civil War. "He always believed this house had chosen our family as much as our family had chosen it. Maybe he was right." The young man nodded thoughtfully. "My professor in structural engineering always says that buildings have stories to tell if we know how to listen. I guess this one was just waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets." In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek Farm underwent a carefully managed transformation. The necessary modernization and repairs proceeded under the guidance of historic preservation specialists, ensuring that the house would be both comfortable for Margaret's continued residence and authentic as a historic property. Modern systems were discreetly integrated into the historic structure, improving efficiency and safety without compromising the home's character. The underground chamber was professionally preserved, its contents meticulously documented before being transferred to the American Civil War Museum's conservation facilities. A selection of items remained on site in specially designed display cases, allowing visitors to experience the discovery in its original context. The museum's conservation team designed a state-of-the-art environmental control system for the chamber, ensuring that it would remain stable and accessible for research and limited public tours. Margaret worked closely with Dr. Layton to develop educational materials that told the complete story of Lieutenant William Holloway's mission, the historical context of the final days of the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley, and the remarkable preservation of the cache through 5 generations of the Holloway family. The narrative emphasized not just military history, but the human dimensions of the story, a soldier's connection to a particular landscape, a family's unwitting stewardship of historical artifacts, and a widow's discovery that transformed crisis into opportunity. The American Civil War Museum's satellite facility in New Liberty opened 6 months after the discovery, creating new jobs and bringing visitors to the small community. The exhibition space contextualized the Willow Creek farm discovery within the broader narrative of the Civil War's impact on the Shenandoah Valley, using interactive displays and carefully chosen artifacts to bring history alive for visitors of all ages. Quarterly guided tours of the underground chamber at Willow Creek Farm became coveted educational experiences, with limited tickets selling out months in advance. These small group tours, led by museum educators and occasionally by Margaret herself, allowed visitors to experience the moment of discovery and understand the historical significance of what Lieutenant Holloway had hidden beneath the stone foundation. Ben Larson found his life transformed as well. His role in the discovery led to an internship with the museum's preservation team, where he was able to apply his engineering studies to practical challenges in historic structure conservation. The experience shaped his academic focus and career path, leading to a specialization in engineering solutions for historic preservation. For Margaret, the transformation was both external and internal. The financial security provided by the museum partnership allowed her to maintain Willow Creek Farm to the highest preservation standards while ensuring her personal comfort. The regular interaction with historians, museum professionals, and interested visitors gave her a new social network and sense of purpose after years of relative isolation following Richard's death. On the 1-year anniversary of the discovery, Margaret hosted a special reception at Willow Creek Farm for everyone who had played a role in preserving the property and its historical treasures. The gathering included Dr. Layton and his colleagues, Sarah Brennan, the museum team, county officials who had helped navigate the regulatory challenges, and the neighbors who had pitched in during the crisis. As twilight settled over the rolling hills of the Shenandoah Valley, Margaret raised a glass in a toast that encompassed both the specific individuals present and the generations who had come before. To Lieutenant William Holloway, who saw in this landscape a place worth fighting for and preserving. To Samuel Holloway, who made this place his family's home after the war's end. To all the Holloways who maintained this house through good times and bad, unknowingly protecting the secrets beneath their feet. To Richard, who sensed those secrets even though he never saw them revealed. And to all of you who helped transform a potential tragedy into an opportunity for preservation and education. She gestured toward the sunset painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same view that had captivated Lieutenant Holloway during his wartime service. This land has witnessed both conflict and healing. It has seen a nation divided and reunited. Now it serves as a place where we can learn from our past while building our future. I can't imagine a better legacy for my family or a better use for this home we've loved for generations. The gathering raised their glasses in response, acknowledging the extraordinary journey that had begun with a flooded basement and culminated in the preservation of a unique piece of American history. The crisis that had threatened to end the Holloway family's connection to Willow Creek Farm had instead renewed and deepened that connection, giving it meaning and purpose that extended far beyond private ownership. As guests mingled on the lawn that Lieutenant William Holloway had once envisioned as the site of his future home, Margaret found herself standing beside Ben Larson, whose simple offer of neighborly help had initiated the chain of events that changed everything. "Mrs. Holloway," the young man said, "my engineering professor says that sometimes the most important discoveries happen when systems fail, when floods or earthquakes or storms reveal what's been hidden beneath the surface. I guess that's true for more than just buildings." Margaret smiled, thinking of how her own life had been revealed in new dimensions through the crisis she'd faced. The flood that had threatened to destroy her home had instead washed away isolation and uncertainty, revealing resources both material and communal that she hadn't known were available to her. "I think you're right, Ben. Sometimes we need the ground to shift beneath our feet before we can see what's really there." As darkness fell over Willow Creek Farm, the lights from the house illuminated the pathway where generations of Holloways had walked. The property that had begun as a Union officer's strategic hiding place had evolved into a family home and now served as both private residence and public historical resource. The boundaries between personal and national history, between private memory and public heritage, had blurred in ways that enriched both dimensions. The underground chamber that had protected its secrets for over 150 years now served as a physical connection between past and present, between the urgent necessities of wartime and the thoughtful preservation of peacetime. The ammunition and payroll cash that Lieutenant William Holloway had hidden to support a nation at war now supported educational initiatives that helped Americans understand their shared history. Margaret Holloway, who had once seen herself primarily as Richard's widow struggling to maintain their home, now understood her role as part of a much longer continuum, the latest in a line of stewards who had, knowingly or unknowingly, preserved something of value for future generations. The discovery beneath her basement floor had not just saved her house. It had revealed the deeper meaning of home as a connection point between past, present, and future. As she closed the door behind the last departing guest, Margaret paused in the entryway. 5 generations of Holloways had entered and exited this house. The crisis that had threatened everything she valued had instead revealed treasures, both material and intangible. The disaster that had seemed like an ending had instead initiated a new chapter in both her life and the ongoing story of Willow Creek Farm. The flooded basement that had appeared to be the final challenge in a series of losses had instead washed away grief and isolation, revealing connections to history, community, and purpose that would sustain her through whatever challenges the future might bring. The underground Civil War ammunition bunker, hidden for over a century and a half, had emerged at precisely the moment when its discovery could have the greatest impact, not just for its monetary value, but for its power to transform understanding and preserve memory. As Margaret turned out the lights and headed upstairs to bed, she felt the presence of all those who had lived in this house before her. Lieutenant William, who had first identified its potential, Samuel, who had purchased it after the war, the generations who had maintained it through depression and prosperity, and Richard, who had loved both the house and its history. The heritage that had once seemed like a burden too heavy for her to carry alone had been revealed as a shared treasure, supported now by a community of historians, preservationists, neighbors, and visitors who recognized its value and contributed to its continuation. The widow, who had once been on the verge of losing everything, had discovered resources beyond anything she could have imagined, not just beneath her basement floor, but in the community around her and in her own capacity for resilience and adaptation. The house that flooding had threatened to destroy had instead been renewed, its true significance revealed, and its future secured for generations yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.